Salvation is of the Lord. It's not of us. Again, we like to turn to the book of Luke, chapter 23. Read the same verses that we read earlier, verses 32 through verse 43. And there were also two other malefactors led with him to be put to death. And when they were come to the place which is called Calvary, there they crucified him and the malefactors, one on the right hand and the other on the left. Then said Jesus, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And they parted his raiment and cast lots. And the people stood beholding. And the rulers also with them derided him, saying, He saved others. Let him save himself, if he be the Christ, the chosen of God. And the soldiers also mocked him, coming to him and offering him vinegar, and saying, If thou be the King of the Jews, save thyself. And a superscription also was written over him in letters of Greek and Latin and Hebrew. This is the King of the Jews. And one of the malefactors which were hanged railed on him, saying, If thou be Christ, save thyself and us. But the other answering rebuked him, saying, Dost not thou fear God, seeing thou art in the same condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we receive the due reward for our deeds, of our deeds. But this man hath done nothing amiss. And he said unto Jesus, Lord, remember me when thou comest into thy kingdom. And Jesus said unto him, Verily I say unto thee, today shalt thou be with me in paradise. Again, what we read here is Luke's account of Christ being crucified between two thieves. This was prophesied in Isaiah 53, verse 12, that Christ would be numbered with the transgressors, and all four gospel writers record that fact, that Christ was crucified between two convicted criminals. On the part of man, this was done to show their disdain for Christ, thinking of him as a criminal. But the bigger picture, on the part of God, I believe it was done for the salvation of this one, and also to provide valuable spiritual lessons for you and I. In these two thieves, we see the condition, we see the need of all of mankind. And in the account, we see the miraculous power of the Lord, His gracious willingness to save unworthy and helpless sinners. The account before us serves as a pattern of salvation. And the truths revealed, of course, are truly amazing and wonderful. But in this message, we want to view and apply the passage differently, other than salvation. We want to view this penitent thief not as a pattern for salvation, but as a pattern for living the life that you and I are called to live. So our subject is the penitent thief, a pattern for living life. The first thing we want to do is consider the scene, because the scene is a very descriptive picture of the world and of the conditions in which you and I, the saved, are to live for the Lord. We want to notice three things concerning this scene. First of all, the place is Calvary. This event takes place, of course, in a very particular place. We read in verse 33, and when they were come to the place which is called Calvary. Now, Matthew, Mark, and John all refer to it as Golgotha. Mark, in his record, gives the interpretation of Golgotha, the place of a skull. John records in John 19:17 that Golgotha is the Hebrew name, and Calvary being the Latin name for this place. So it's the same place, Calvary, Golgotha. We know from Hebrews 13 and verse 12 that it was outside of the walls of Jerusalem. And we gather from John 19, verses 41 and 42, that there was a burial ground very nearby. So Golgotha, or Calvary, was a place where the Romans would put guilty criminals to death by crucifixion. So it was a place of suffering. It was a place of great distress. It was a place of great sorrow. All the stories that could be told about this place and the suffering and the distress and the sorrow. It no doubt was a place of heartbreak. It was a place of humiliation. It was a place of indignity. It was a place of disgrace. It was a place of dread. It was a place of fear. It was an appalling place. It was an abominable place. And may I say, you and I are called to serve God in such a place. Secondly, consider the spirit of the scene. We read in verse 35, and the people stood beholding. We read in verse 48, and all the people that came together to that sight. So there was quite a gathering at this site. The gathering consisted of the general public. Some of them, no doubt, were there out of curiosity. There were the religious and military leaders of the day. And there's just a mass of people gathered that day. And we read in Matthew 27, verse 36, that some sat down and watched him there. And there they sit. You can only imagine the facial expressions of many of these. They sat down and they watched him there. We read in Matthew 27:39 that some passed by, others just walked by. And as they did, we read that they reviled or they denounced and slandered him. And then in verse 49 of Luke 23, we read of those who stood afar off, beholding these things. So looking at this crowd, we see some are sitting, but their attention is upon Christ. Some are standing. Their attention is upon Christ. Some are walking by, and their attention is upon Christ. Now, the overall spirit and attitude of this crowd was really set before the people even arrived at the place. And the scene that was set, or the spirit that was set, only increased in fervor as the people arrived. So leading up to this scene, Jesus, of course, had been betrayed, been arrested. He was bound and led away to Annas. From there, he would be led to Caiaphas, the high priest, where he was questioned concerning the accusations that had been brought against him. And it was determined there that he was guilty of death. And they spit upon him. He was buffeted and smitten. Caiaphas and the council became enraged at the response of Christ, and the next morning he was led away to Pilate, the governor. They said to Pilate in Luke 23:2, "We found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to give tribute to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ, a king." What we see here is a spirit of absolute hatred of Jesus Christ. They viewed Christ as a distorter. He perverteth, as a corrupter. Pilate would proceed to question Jesus, and he declared in Luke 23:4, "I find no fault in this man." The response of the people is recorded in verse 5. "And they were the more fierce," or savage, "saying, He stirreth up the people, teaching throughout all Jewry, beginning from Galilee to this place." So here's the spirit that's being set. They are very disturbed at his teaching. And they became more fierce. In other words, the spirit is growing in intensity. It was at this point that Pilate discovered that Jesus belonged to the jurisdiction of Herod. So he sends him to Herod, who also proceeded to question Jesus and found nothing worthy of death in him. But notice verse 11. "And Herod with his men of war set him at naught." Considered him to be nothing. He's not worth our time. "And they mocked him and arrayed him in a gorgeous robe and sent him again to Pilate." He's not worth our time. That's the spirit that's being established. He's not worthy of our attention. And they begin to mock. The spirit is building, leading into our text. So Jesus is again before Pilate. Verse 13, "Pilate called together the chief priests and the rulers of the people. And he said unto them, Neither I nor Herod find anything worthy of death in this man." Pilate, he wants to set Christ free, but he wants to do so without compromising himself in the eyes of his superiors. So he makes reference to a custom that was regularly practiced. That custom was the releasing of a prisoner during the Passover. And since some prisoner must be released and set free, Pilate thinks this is my opportunity of allowing the innocent Christ to go free. So he offers to chastise Jesus and then set him free. And instead of Jesus, we will crucify Barabbas, the most notorious of all the criminals. But the people, in unison, verse 18, begin to cry out, "Away with this man," that is Jesus, "and release unto us Barabbas." Pilate can't believe what he's hearing. So he makes the offer the second time, there in verse 20. And then in verse 21, we again see the response. "But they cried, saying, Crucify him! Crucify him!" Speaking of Christ. Pilate then, for the third time, declared the innocence of Christ. And the response of the people, verse 23, "And they were intent with loud voices, requiring that he might be crucified. And the voices of them and the chief priests prevailed." They had more respect for a notorious criminal than they did Jesus Christ. They preferred a notorious criminal to Christ. This spirit intensifies, leading to our text. At this time, according to Matthew's account, Matthew 27:26, Pilate scourged Jesus and delivered him or handed him over to be crucified. And notice, if we go there, Matthew 27. Matthew 27. Verses 27 through 31. "Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the common hall, and gathered unto him the whole band of soldiers. And they stripped him, and put unto him a scarlet robe. And when they had platted a crown of thorns, they put it upon his head, and a reed in his right hand, and they bowed the knee before him, mocking him, and mocked him, saying, Hail, King of the Jews. And they spit upon him, and took the reed, and smote him on the head. And after that they had mocked him, they took the robe off of him, and put his own raiment on him, and led him away to crucify him. You see a spirit that is filling the air. As the procession heads to the place of crucifixion, the face of Jesus is more marred than the face of any man. Isaiah 53 or Isaiah 52. And the flesh of his back has now been torn to shreds. And the muscles and tissues have been severely lacerated by the scourging. There are people in front, there are people behind hurrying the procession along. And the disdain and the hatred and the scorn and the furious malice, the disgust and the hostility, and the derision and the contempt toward Christ is building each step of the way. Again, we have here is a people who had more respect for Barabbas than the two thieves than they did for Christ. The spirit was one of Antichrist, a spirit of darkness, a spirit of uncleanness and lies. It is a spirit of ignorance and rejection. It is a scene or spirit that finds Christ to be an annoyance and an irritation. It is a spirit that considers Christ to be the problem. He's more of a problem than Barabbas in their eyes. He's the lowest of the low. All of this was building in intensity as they head to this place, Calvary or Golgotha. And by the time they get to Calvary, the hatred for Christ is even more frenzied. It leads us to the activity of this scene. 3 crosses, 2 of them, 2 low-down thieves. Upon the center cross, Jesus, the Son of God. As the people sit and watch, and as they stand and behold, and as they pass by, the attention is upon that center cross. And the one on that cross is far more despised and hated than the 2 thieves upon the other crosses. Far more scorn, far more disgust and hostility and animosity toward the one on that center cross than the 2 thieves. And they consider the one on that center cross to be worse and more intolerable than the thieves. And they mock, and they taunt, and they ridicule, and they curse the one on that center cross. Notice over in Mark chapter 15. Mark 15, verses 29 through verse 32. And they that passed by railed on him, wagging their heads, shaking their heads, and saying, Ah, thou that destroyest the temple and buildest it in 3 days. A lie, based on a lie. Save thyself and come down from the cross. Likewise also the chief priests mocking said among themselves with the scribe, He saved others. Himself he cannot save. Let Christ, the King of Israel, descend now from the cross, that we may see and believe. And they that were crucified with him reviled him. We see in our text, verse 35, and the people stood beholding. And we see he saved others. Let him save himself, if he be Christ, the chosen of God. We see the soldiers also mocked, saying, If thou be the King of the Jews, save thyself. So we see the activity. It's one of mockery and hatred. But not only were those sitting there and those who were standing and those who passed by showing their utter disdain, but on those 2 crosses the thieves were doing the same. As we saw this morning, Matthew 27:44, Mark 15:32. So here's the setting. The setting is a horrible, appalling, and abominable place. The scene is one of demonic disdain and distrust. The air is filled with furious malice, rage, and attack toward Christ. Everywhere there is mockery, taunting, ridicule, insults, and blasphemy toward Christ. And it was in this setting, it was in this scene that the one thief was gloriously saved. And it is in this setting, it is in this scene that he becomes an example and a pattern for you and I, who live in a time when the forces of hell have mounted a full-scale assault toward Christ. with their demonic rage intensifying by the hour. That's the scene of what is before us. In this passage, it is also the scene in which you and I live. That brings us to our second main point, and that is we want to consider this one thief. And we want to look at 7 things concerning this thief. And in these 7 things, he becomes our pattern for living in this scene in which we live. Number 1, he came under the influence of the almighty power of God. And if you and I that are saved are going to live for and serve God in such a setting, in such a scene, we must come under the influence of the almighty power of God. In Ephesians 5, verse 18, we have this exhortation: be filled with the Spirit. There is no other way to live for the Lord. If you and I are going to live for and serve God in such a setting and scene, we must have the continual, ongoing, perpetual overflow of the Spirit of God. We must be under the power, the influence, the effect, the sway of the Spirit of God. This thief, in the setting and scene of Golgotha, was hearing and was witnessing the hatred, the ridicule, the blasphemy spewing forth toward Christ. But this thief had come under the influencing power of God. And as a result, he rose above the spirit and activity of that day. He came under the influence of the almighty power of God, and there was a manifest difference in his spirit from the spirit and activity of the day. You and I, living in this day, remember, they set him at naught. The masses today set Jesus Christ at naught. He's not worthy of our attention. They shrug off God. They shrug off the message of God. They shrug off the day of God. And they are satisfied. The religious crowd is satisfied with spiritual mediocrity, satisfied with their hypocrisy, and satisfied with their mechanical religion. And in this day of self, we must be under the influence of Almighty God if we're going to live for Him. This world is in opposition to Christ. This world is antagonistic toward Christ. This world is a detriment to the life that you and I are called to live, the life that we are responsible to live. And if we're going to live that life, we must be under the influence of the Almighty God. There's no other way. So as a result of this man being under the influence of the almighty power of God, number 2, he was of a different mindset. After he came under the influence of God, he has a completely different mindset. Prior to coming under the influence of the almighty power of God, he was part of the atmosphere and spirit of Golgotha. But coming under the working of his mighty power, He was no longer sucked in by the evil influence that was all around him. He was no longer governed by that influence. He was no longer shaped by that spirit and activity that was all around him. His entire thought process has changed. We hear him say, "This man hath done nothing amiss." The polar opposite of the thought process of the masses that had gathered that day. For the most part, the crowd that gathered that day were blasphemers. But in a very perverted twist, they make Christ the blasphemer. It's today, folks. This is where we are. The blasphemers make him the blasphemer. Oh, the twisted mindset of fallen man. The power of God upon our lives will prevent us from being taken in and engulfed by the evil influence and ways all around us and the vileness of the times. There's no other way. We have to be under the influence of God. Being under the influence of the working of His mighty power will give you a different mindset from the ways, the reasonings, the philosophies, the conclusions. People confuse today facts and conclusions. The conclusion. There's nothing wrong with science today. The problem is the conclusions that depraved men, draw from science. That's where you get evolution. There's nothing wrong with science. It's the conclusions of depraved man. The thief in the setting and scene of Golgotha. He was seeing, he was hearing the hatred, the ridicule, the blasphemy toward Christ. He's surrounded by it. He's bombarded with it. And so it is today. We're surrounded by it. We're bombarded with it. But coming under the influence of the power of God, he's a different mindset. Thirdly, he had courage. It was in this setting and scene of Golgotha that he had the courage to rebuke the other thief and speak of reverence toward God. Notice verse 40. Dost not thou fear God, seeing thou art in the same condemnation? Dost not thou reverence God? Surrounded by demonic influence, the very midst of disdain, hatred, malice, and rage toward Christ, this man, under the influence of the power of the Almighty, said to the other thief who was spewing hatred toward Christ, "Dost not thou fear God?" In the midst of mass irreverence. Oh, how we need to be a people of courage and audacity for the glory of God. Hear this thief speak in the midst of abomination. And he says, "Dost not thou fear God?" Under the influence of the working of His mighty power, he has a different mindset. But he also has the courage. He has the audacity to speak of reverence toward a holy God. Oh, for such courage today. Oh, for the audacity to speak of reverence for God. We need to be a people of courage. We need to be a people of audacity to speak for what is holy and right. Well, that wouldn't be politically correct. We're not talking about political correctness. We're talking about what's right and wrong. A lot of folks need to get over the theories of a satanic system. This man had courage to speak the truth. This thief in the setting and scene of Golgotha, he was hearing, he was witnessing the hatred, the ridicule, the blasphemy spewing forth toward Christ. And having come under the influence of the power of God, he not only was of a different mindset of the masses around him, he was possessed with a courageous spirit. And he spoke. Fourthly, coming under the power and influence of God, he recognized sin as a terrible thing. Notice verse 41 again. And we indeed justly, for we receive the due reward of our deeds. He recognizes sin. He was not indifferent towards sin, whether it was his own or others. The power of God upon our lives will not allow us to continue in or to deny or to ignore, or to excuse, or to justify or minimize sin, whether it be ours or others. But instead, the power of God upon our lives will lead us to confess it, hate it, and turn from it. And we indeed justly. This thief is under the influence of the working of his mighty power. And being under the influence of his mighty power, he does not seek to redefine sin. Does not seek to redefine his own sin. Does not seek to redefine the sin of others. But he viewed sin in the light of this man. This man had done nothing amiss. And now he finds the taunts coming out of the other thief to be repulsive and frightening to him. When sin becomes less repulsive and fearful to the child of God, you're in a bad place. You don't even realize how bad of a place you're in. You're in a bad place. But this man, under the influence of God, found what was coming from the mouth of this thief over here to be repulsive. And he rebuked him. And he rebuked him. Coming under the influence and power of God, he's of a different mindset. He has courage. He recognizes sin and he stands against it. God's people need to stand against sin. We need to love the sinner. We need to pray that God would save the sinner. But we need to be against their sin. We need to be against our own sin. Don't fall into the redefining of sin. Recognize sin for what it is. Rebellion against God. Find it repulsive. Most of all, our own sin. Fifthly, he calls attention to Christ. It was in the setting and scene of Golgotha, in the very midst of the spirit of Antichrist, that this man in verse 41, unashamedly and without any embarrassment said, "But this man hath done nothing amiss." That's quite a statement in the spirit of that crowd. This man hath done nothing amiss. In the setting and scene of Golgotha, he spoke of the perfection of Jesus Christ. And let me tell you something. Those who prefer Barabbas to Christ, they're not going to think too highly of you saying, this man hath done nothing amiss. This man in the midst of darkness, this man in the midst of ignorance, blindness, hatred, and demonic rage, called attention to Jesus Christ. This man. John in 1 John 4:3, speaking of the spirit of Antichrist, declares, even now already is it in the world. Realize the Antichrist is yet to come. He may be living right now, but he's yet to be revealed. But the spirit of Antichrist is in this world. And that's what's preparing for the tribulation period. The spirit of Antichrist. It is the spirit of Antichrist that finds Christ to be an annoyance. Jesus Christ is an annoyance to a lot of folks. Finds Christ to be a bother. Finds Him to be an irritation. Finds Him to be the problem. Find Him to be very aggravating. And we live in such a world. And just like this man who had come under the influence of Almighty God, we must call attention to Jesus Christ. Well, they're going to get mad. Oh, yes, they are. Yes, they will. That doesn't have a thing to do with it. It's what they need to hear. We hear him say in a completely different tone than the tone of the hour, this man hath done nothing amiss. And here we are, in a world engulfed in filthiness, a world engulfed in wickedness, and they don't see anything wrong with it. Sadly, many of God's people don't see anything wrong with it. But we must come under the power and influence of God and rise above it all and say with certainty, this man, this man, this man. He called attention to Jesus Christ. And we need to say loud and clear, this man, the very one whom the masses were directing their rage, he's the solution. He's the answer. He's the remedy. You realize today that people who are offering the solutions to our problems don't even know what the problem is? It's amazing. They don't even know what the problem is. The problem is a spiritual problem. And if you don't know what the problem is, how in the world can you have the answer? You can't. And yet God's people look to people for solutions who don't even know what the problem is. And sadly, many of God's people don't know what the problem is. The problem is a spiritual problem. And that's why attention needs to be drawn to Christ, because He's the answer. He's the remedy. We'll raise taxes, we'll cut taxes. Neither one is a solution. Neither one address the problem. Problem is a spiritual problem. And God's people need to stand up and point to Jesus Christ. This man is who you need. He's the answer. And that's what this thief does. He's of a different mindset. He has courage. He recognizes sin to be sin. And he stands against it. He's repulsed by it. And he calls attention to Christ. Sixthly, he was not ashamed to acknowledge Him as Lord and King. That's quite a step in this, what was going on here. Verse 42, and he said unto Jesus, Lord, remember me when thou comest into thy kingdom. Well, if you have a kingdom, you must be the king. When thou comest into thy kingdom. In the setting and scene of Golgotha, we need to be a people that speak with clarity and plainness. He is my king. He is my king. Well, I am a Democrat. I am a Republican. I am an independent. He is my king. That should be the emphasis. Jesus is my king. Well, if Jesus is your king, you'll be a Republican or whatever. Are you that foolish? He is my king. So here we are, living in the setting of Golgotha. Oh, that God would come and work in us in the midst of the hatred, in the midst of the ridicule, and the blasphemy, and the malice, and in the midst of that which is demonic, and point to Jesus and say loud and clear, I'm not unsure, I'm not uncertain, I don't need time to think about it. Jesus Christ is my King. And I pledge my allegiance to Him. He's my King. That's what this man was saying. When thou comest into thy kingdom. This thief, in the setting and scene of Golgotha, was hearing and was witnessing the hatred and the ridicule and the blasphemy, spewing forth toward Christ, but having come under the influence of God. Seventhly and lastly, he was not ashamed to be identified with Christ. I'll be honest. There's times I'm ashamed to be identified with certain children of God. But I don't have anything to be ashamed of being identified with Christ. This man was not ashamed. In considering the scene, considering the spirit of that event, he was not ashamed of being identified with Christ. The vast majority of people that gathered that day loudly and vehemently attacked and denounced Jesus Christ. They were openly rebellious. They were openly defiant toward Christ. But this man, having come under the influence of the almighty power of God, he looks toward Christ and says, Lord, remember me when thou comest into thy kingdom. Notice those words, Lord, me. Lord, me. He's identifying himself with Christ. He's saying Jesus is king. And he has a kingdom. And that kingdom's not of this world. And I want to be identified with Jesus the King and be a part of that kingdom which is not of this world. So here we are, living in the setting and scene of Golgotha. And we must not be assimilated into the world system. But we must always maintain a desire to be identified with Him. So all of this, these 7 things that we've just mentioned, are the direct result of the almighty power of God working in his life. That's what we need. That's what we need. That's what we ought to plead for. Lord, work in my life. With the same power that caused Christ to come out of that tomb. Work in my life. As a result of that working, this man was made different. This man was made different. You and I ought to have no desire to fit into this world. Why would you want to fit in? Why would you want that? We should have no desire to fit into this world. We ought to have every desire to be different. And you don't have to come up with all these weird theories to be different. All you have to do is obey His Word. You'll be different. That's all you have to do. You don't have to come up with something ignorant and foolish. Just obey His Word. You'll be different. And if we experience this mighty working power, we'll be lifted above what goes on all around us. Oh, we all get way too caught up in the things that go on around us. And if we're not careful, we start to mold and shape our lives by those things. Oh, we need the almighty working power of God that would raise us above all that's going around us. And this man was focused upon Christ. That's where our focus needs to be. Upon Jesus Christ. Upon Jesus Christ. God help us to live like we ought to in the scene and in the spirit of Golgotha. Don't kid yourself. If Christ were alive today, the result would be the same. Oh, we're more educated. Don't kid yourself. Don't get all high and mighty about your so-called education. It wouldn't be any different. There's a hatred for Jesus Christ. We are a remnant. That remnant, I believe, is getting smaller all the time. But we need to be a remnant that points to Jesus Christ. This man, He's the answer. He's the answer. He's the answer. There is no other answer. This man. Or Dave, if you'd come and lead us, verse